Now right kind of in here, and again the fire started one afternoon back over here and blew up what 100 acres or something the first afternoon, and then I saw that smoke and came out and said, oh, what's going on, and then determined, oh, it's a new fire over here. But having experienced the Bowles Creek fire, which was off on that horizon 4 years before, it had blown up and it just kind of stayed out there for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks and didn't come too far. So I figured, oh, we had 10 miles between us and the fire. We were relatively secure. The next day that fire moved from there to right there, and of course my house is right there. So yeah,
which way is that the origin then?
that's west.
Right about over there?
Right, right. Right up around that corner. Yep. And yeah. So one of the things that that I do is large-scale conservation planning and application of conservation strategies, and the primary strategy we focus on is one that tries to maintain biological diversity based on maintaining, first of all, the ecosystem diversity that a landscape had in it. And if you do that, you provide for all, as Travis mentioned, all of the conditions that the biodiversity in that landscape depended on. And so we do a lot of work looking at understanding historical landscapes and historical mixes of ecosystems. And so whenever I go into an area, I look at, well, what does this landscape look like today, and what might it look like under historical disturbance regimes? And in this landscape, we're in a relatively drier part of the Clearwater Valley here, and this landscape down here, if you know Daubenmeier habitat typings, we'd be in the dry or a warm dry end of those. And this kind of location would have been heavy to probably a fairly frequent fire regime, particularly with that Native American influence we've been hearing about, and probably pretty heavy to ponderosa pine and certainly larch mixed in, particularly on the north slopes, and then some Doug fir. But we probably would have had a lot of big ponderosa pine and larch scattered all through here. So some mixed severity going on, but a lot of non-lethal fire too. What we have now, since this is, we are now here on Plum Creek timberland, so it's commercial forest land. We came through, you can kind of see the difference. Where the timber gets thicker is state land, and where you have any real larger trees left anywhere around is Forest Service. So we have a mix of those three landowners out here. But with the past management of those lands, all of the large tree component on the Plum Creek land anyway was removed, and there was Doug fir and other regen, lodgepole and such coming in. But after Jocko Lake's fire now, the question becomes, what do you do with this kind of landscape that should have a big tree component all scattered through it, and it's no longer there? And we've switched it from what could support a non-lethal fire regime to one that's going to be hard to not have in a stand replacing or lethal fire regime. So that's going to be a restoration challenge here. Obviously it's a long-term challenge because we can't get big trees back for 200 years. This will come back lodgepole, and you know, the lodgepole is the more immediate. You probably in places where, particularly on more of the Forest Service land where there's still some residual ponderosas, you probably will get more of that regen. And on north slopes you'll probably pick up more Doug fir and larch.
What did it look like before it burned?
Well, this was a fairly young stand out here and fairly open. The Plum Creek had gone through this with a fairly heavy harvest.
I see a lot of stumps. Was that cut after the fire or before the fire?
That was all pretty much before the fire.
It was really sparse.
Well, and anything that was left on Plum Creek, they did come in and salvage after the fire. So what that mix was, it's hard to say.
This would have been young lodgepole then. Really,
There was a lot of young stuff all through here, lodgepole and ponderosa, and Doug fir. It was a mix of species. Yeah. So the other question that this brings up is what kind of, we've talked a little about some of the scale issues, and we can talk about the non-lethal fire and talk about big areas that typically burned with an understory fire, and then you'd have this kinds of stand conditions that we were in this morning with larch or ponderosa, and there's a lot you can do in there and go in and thin them out and talk about patch sizes occurring within those and what kind of residual you want in the trees remaining. But when we move, and then at the other end we have where stand replacing fires occurred, and you can obviously get fairly big expanses of those burns in cool moist sites on this valley, burned heavily to stand replacing fire. But in between we have this whole mixed severity fire regime, and one of the challenges to that is, as we've been talking about, is trying to understand what that patch dynamics was. How much of those landscapes had that large tree kind of stand like we were in this morning, and how much of it was patches of stand replacing fire. And so when you start characterizing what was out there on a landscape, and I think Travis put in a little diagram in your handout that kind of looks at any place in this landscape. If you pick a patch of a 1/10 acre or something like that, could have burned with a stand replacing fire or a non-lethal fire. What's the fire regime? Well, it's really the pattern then that occurs in and how much of it. But defining what the right scale is for that, is do you use a 50 acre or a 200 acre kind of measure of how much of that 50 or 200 acres burned with high intensity or low intensity or moderate intensity. So it's a real complex fire regime that we're dealing with here, and trying to characterize it is kind of a challenge because you have these scale issues that come into play. And yet we have to try to characterize it if we want to define that conservation strategy that says we need to try to maintain those conditions that were here historically if we want to provide all the right conditions for all of our biodiversity. So those are things we're working on from an ecological side of things, and we're working with the collaborative now in trying to really get a good handle on what do we want to have for those kind of desired conditions as we move forward. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, since there's a subdivision over on the other side, when the collaborative is talking about restoration treatments and mixed severity fires, is when you're close to a subdivision or a watershed that supplies water or something, do you consider that in terms of, well, we're going to move it more low severity and not have a desire to have any high severity, or
when you're within the fire plan identifies the wildland urban interface, and when you're within the WUI, obviously the priority is going to be looking at first fuels and minimizing risk to lives and structures and trying to get defensible space in there. So that just becomes your primary objective. If you can work some restoration into that, great, but your priority is to do the fuels mitigation. When you get outside, I mean, obviously we're in the WUI here. You got a house right here that survived the fire, several others right up on that hillside over there. The only house that was lost was down on the edge of this meadow down here, and it was actually out in the open, but they had just put in a new deck with fresh wood, and a ember apparently landed on the deck and it caught it on fire, and the house burned up, and it was out, like I say, in the middle of, it had great defensive space around it, but it was just one of those unlucky things.
Did these other houses survive?
Yep. Yeah. Everything else.
Survived.
Yep.
And why did they survive?
Well, there had been some fuel thinning done, and in these cases, it's a good question. They made it through okay.
Did they evacuate?
Oh, there was nobody out here. Once that fire got cooking that second morning, they pulled all the resources off of it, and there really weren't any available. And it went and it hit the ridge line above where I lived back there on that first night, and the wind died, and the fire was just sort of sitting there. And the next day, we just about never have fire or wind from the east, and the wind came from the east and just kind of blew back on it, and gave them a day to get some resources in here. And as Roger Scott was saying on the bus, one of the resources they pulled in that was available were 2 planes, dipper planes out of Canada that could come down and scoop up, what'd you say, 8,000 gallons of 5,000 gallons of water. They were able to dip into Seeley Lake and hit the front line on this fire every 8 minutes with 5,000 gallons of water. So it made a huge difference of them, instead of doing the standard, finding a safe anchor point and starting to work a fire line around it, they took on this fire at the head because it was moving right towards my house. So I thank them for that.
Did they put any hand line or dozer line in?
There's a ton of hand line, ton of dozer lines.
On that front?
Yeah, there were dozer lines. There was a lot of retardant.
Crossed a dozer line, but that first day your house got hit by retardant.
Yeah, my neighbor actually got knocked down by retardant as they were getting out of their house and all. So yeah, there were planes. It was a real air show that first afternoon. They had
While we're on
everything
this
flying
topic
around.
of suppression during a big fire event like that in private lands, I want to get some clarification on a point that was somehow needled yesterday in the panel discussion at the end. You know, what about federal firefighting on private property?
Well, the DNRC, the state has a responsibility for all state and private land in the state of Montana. And our directive is full suppression. We cooperate with the Forest Service in what we call offset protection in the state of Montana. So the state protects the equal number of acres relative 50 plus or minus 50 or 100,000 acres as the Forest Service protects state and private land. So we have a shared responsibility where, okay, it doesn't make sense for us to have our own individual fire units and not share that responsibility. So like in the Bitterroot Valley, there's no DNRC protection, but the Forest Service provides the protection on state and private land there, and then we provide a lot of protection on the Lolo Forest, the Flathead Forest, and other areas, and so we do that offset. But we have that responsibility, and then we work with the volunteer fire departments. We're responsible to train and work with the volunteer fire departments, and we bring them into what we call initial attack agreements. They have the structured protection with the volunteer fire departments, and we have the wildland protection. In eastern Montana, it's a county co-op program where the counties actually take over that protection in non-forested land.
So wasn't that a Condon Mountain fire where you worked with the Flathead?
Yeah, that was a cost share fire.
And
Yeah.
how was the sort of suppression philosophy and multiple objectives philosophy? How did all of that mesh?
That was the reason that Condon Mountain fire was.
Firefighters doing the structure protection, or is it also related to spending federal dollars to protect structures?
You know, I believe what you just described here in Montana is probably exactly what's happening in Oregon and happens in a lot of places. That there was a really strong concern expressed by somebody in the crowd yesterday about feds fighting fire on private property, maybe inappropriately spending public federal dollars.
Right.
I love this explanation. You know, it's a cooperative.
But the state is protecting the private land.
The state is, or the state and the feds are cooperating where there's a mix of private and
So
federal.
there's state money is spent on private land.
And the local fire department.
Right. But for Jocko, I mean, a lot of that was, and Alan can speak to this, I mean, a lot of that becomes, I mean, there were federal dollars infused into that, and so one part of the issue is what color the money is. The other part of the issue, and I think this is, we had our standards, our initial fire training just recently, and you know, part of what we're struggling with internally is Forest Service people are wildland firefighters. We're not trained to do structure protection, and so the one part of the issue is, you know, just the question last year about the shops getting burnt over on that Yarnell fire, and were they going to do structure protection? I think one part of the question is, who's doing the different kinds of protection, and do we have firefighters untrained for structure protection trying to do that. And then the second part is, what color is the money, and are we spending federal dollars on protecting people's homes, which absolutely on these big fires we are.
Yeah.
Does Plum Creek provide funding for suppression on their own?
I'm sure they pay the state.
Yep.
We did.
They pay the state.
About per acre, right, Roger?
They pay an insurance, they call it, which is so much per acre for each.
LRP stands for Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And so kind of the two new pieces, although it's really not that new, are the collaboration piece of it as kind of the new model going forward for the Forest Service. And then the landscape idea, looking at things at a bigger scale than maybe typically the Forest Service did at, kind of a stand by stand or project by project scale. And so there were initially 10 landscapes chosen across the country for this new funding. It was you get up to 40 million per project per year for 10 years. And since 4 million, sorry, yes. 40 was the full, yes. And yeah. Since then, 13 new landscapes have been chosen across the country. So now there's 23. Were some more added this last year? Still 23? Okay. And so the Southwest Crown Collaborative was one of the original 10 that was chosen. And it basically stretches from the Swan Lake District, which when we get up to Cold Summit is just over the ridge basically from Cold Summit, the Seeley Lake District on the low, and then the Lincoln District on the Helena National Forest. And our collaborative was formed, and during the proposal process you had to put a bid in basically for these funds. And so a collaborative was formed. There were some local collaboratives already in place that are still that we work with kind of hand in hand. But the Southwest Crown Collaborative meets about once a month. Through the summer here, we'll be having a lot of field trips, coming out and doing this very thing. And something that I was hired on to do was our collaborative decided early on that 10% of the funds that came in would go towards monitoring. And so that's what I was hired to do through the University of Montana, was to help coordinate this monitoring program, a multi-party monitoring program. And so we have a fairly large monitoring committee, probably 40 people or so, divided up into 4 different working groups: aquatics, vegetation and fuels, wildlife, and socioeconomics. And so we've got, each one of those working groups has a handful of different projects, that monitoring projects that they've developed, really to look at the effectiveness of the work being done under the CFLRP program. So that's a little bit of background on the program for those that don't know anything about it. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Can you speak to the monitoring and how consistent the monitoring is from one CFLRP to another?
It is, yeah. I'll tell you, it's,
For a scientist, the power of that kind of data is being able to look at the costing and cost structure.
right, and we've had a lot of those discussions. I was actually, me and 2 or 3 other people on a couple of the other projects, one down in Arizona on the 4-Fry, actually 2 of them were down there in the 4-Fry. We started a monitoring network to try and bring the monitoring programs for each of the projects together, and we quickly realized everybody's doing it completely differently. And so we've tried to get conversations going across projects, but frankly it's been difficult. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of it has to do with who's at the table, what their interests are, what are the particular interests in that community and on that forest. And so it's varied a lot. But we've had those conversations about.
How stable is it over time in a given CFLRP? Is evolving your protocol from year to year?
Well, I can only speak for the Southwest Crown, but we started with a group of projects and we're just kind of moving those forward. Some last 3 or 4 years. Some of them we plan on taking the full 10 years to do. So it really just depends on the project.
Just to tie in with your question from the Uncompahgre about how much do you need, I think, when we first started, I mean, I like literally came to Montana and fell into this this group and started asking people what is mixed severity fire restoration, and people that had been working here for 30 years kind of shrugged their shoulders like that. And part of it, I think, is we still are struggling with it, which is why we have these conversations about what's the right scale, what's the right patch size. Well, this is probably too big. Well, then what would be, just about right? And so there's lots of uncertainty, and I think that John's work did some modeling to suggest what's within different ecoregions or ecosites within the Southwest Crown. What would you expect the landscape composition to be? And then, but knowing that there's lots of uncertainty still with the issue, we sort of said, well, monitoring is the thing that moves us from the risks of inaction, which I put in this, one of our questions was sort of, so what are the risks and trade-offs with action or inaction in mixed conifer, mixed severity fire regime? So there's, sort of oftentimes we focus on that risk of action, as stakeholders, and yet there's also this risk of inaction. And so how do you deal with that with sort of developing science? We're sort of on the cutting edge of what do we mean by restoration in mixed severity fire regimes, but knowing that there's risks of inaction. So let's invest in monitoring so that we recognize that there are those risks of inaction, so that we can move forward and support projects, but also knowing that we're going to try to do the best monitoring and adaptive management. That there's trust building, there's science reasons to do that. So I just wanted to sort of tie up those two ends there, and then connect up with what John has presented. So.
Lost my train of thought
Yeah,
there.
no, sorry.
Is this considered wildland urban interface here?
Definitely.
Yeah. So you want low intensity fire. You don't want. Would you recommend mixed severity or low intensity fire?
Well, since you got a house right there, you would want to keep a fairly low intensity fire. Certainly, if you looked at extensibles, first 100, 200 feet of that house, you want basically no fire or very, very little fire. And you certainly wouldn't want a 200-foot flame wall coming into this right here. So you would hopefully create a condition through here that it wouldn't carry a continuous ground fire, and whether you called that a mixed severity. And again, I would go back and look at what you expected to be here from an historical standpoint. And if you can do both restoration and fuel mitigation at the same time, then that's great. And if this area historically supported primarily a non-lethal fire regime, your goal could very well be compatible to do both fuel mitigation and the restoration to try to move it back into that kind of condition. Although it'd be a real challenge here now with it starting out at this point.
What could you do now with this couple hundred acres in front of us? Plan?
Possibly, if it was coming in as lodgepole now, and you felt it really needed some ponderosa or larch or other of those species in here, planting is certainly an option, particularly if you don't have a seed source to bring those in.
Now this is private still,
This is.
so you'd have to get their cooperation to do that.
Well, yeah, and so
They
Plum
wouldn't-
Plum Creek is still.
Make money out of it.
Well, what they want to do with this land right now really is sell it, but they've been divesting most of their lands,
Sell it for home building?
whatever.
Lots.
Here, yeah, I mean that's one of those questions that comes up is where and how much development do you continue to have that it spreads out that wildland urban interface? And those are political questions for the county.
In the absence of all the houses, I'd say, you let fire reestablish the landscape memory here, which it'll do topographically and vegetatively appropriately over the next century.
That's a big if, though, and this goes back to, differing suppression policies and how we define. I mean, because, if fire burnt through here again in 5 years, I mean, maybe you're going to establish some permanent shrub fields or whatever, but if we go, I mean, it's going to be pretty easy to suppress out here for a while now, relatively, and so if we're successful with suppression again for 40 or 50 years, then
then you're
bring
gonna
back
have a
into
mess.
it. So
You're gonna have a mess here.
So those are, I mean, those are things that hopefully are going to play out, you know, in the public and political venue where we can not be in a full suppression mode all the time.
That's one of the things that, of the $35 million cost for this fire, the state for 95% of that, because this is state fire protection even though it's on federal ground. So this is all state, 95% was state cost share and 5% was tribe. Forest Service didn't pay for any of this fire.
Now, this is Plum Creek, right?
Right. And that's why the state has fire protection. Because of the 18,000 acres of Plum Creek ground, the state has fire protection here. This was all state fire protection. And we went for a FEMA grant. And it looks like there was $1.5 million of rehab that FEMA paid 75% of that back to the state. The state bore those costs too. And then $400,000 for bear for the forestry.
So what, can you talk a little bit about the rehabilitation and what went on and how that differed with ownership?
Yeah. And how are we time check? Where are we at, guys?
We'll get about 5 more minutes.
Okay. So just real quick, there was over 100 miles of dozer line on this fire. Back over there on that divide, that high snowy divide, there was about 6 miles where we did a contingency line where we had skidders and feller bunchers and all that. So we had dozer line, we had contingency line. The restoration plan differed a little bit. We worked with Roger for the Plum Creek lands. That dozer line we didn't rehabilitate to the same degree that we did on federal lands. On federal lands where we had dozer line, pretty much came back in with an excavator, you know, reseeded all that stuff, put trees back across it to you know, allow that to reestablish more quickly. I think on these guys' lands, to keep costs down, that was not quite as intensive.
Go for it.
Yeah, and so that was, you know, that was a huge part of the cost. We had 6 to 8 excavators working out here doing the rehab. As part of the rehab plan, you're also putting mag chloride on the roads, had to gravel some of the roads. You know, you had a lot of equipment coming in here, reseeding, some level of replanting. There's other things that I'm sure I'm missing, you know, and then down the road, the bear stuff that Alan mentioned becomes, you know, there were culverts that got burnt through. There were some roads that we wound up decommissioning where you were going to have problems with water down the road or upsizing culverts and that sort of thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so with the plan, so that's the dozer reconstruction that changed a little bit with ownership of just about everything else. I mean, things weren't tiered too much to ownership or like long.
Time to
All right.
roll.
Yeah, we should probably get going. We'll talk some more about collaboration in our last stop, because it was a.
No, not too much. I mean, nuances, but not too much.
How'd you decide, you know, what to prioritize for planting? Was it just like erosion issues or more reestablishment of the trees?
Yeah, the planning stuff's kind of out of my realm. That's more in the silviculture realm, and we have, you know, our forest plans from '86, and so, you know, talking about like what John was saying, I mean, we have certain things that trigger replanting, and I'm sure there's places out here where we're coming in and planting, and I think we do it less and less now because of the, you know, cost and whatnot, but we're triggered to replant in a lot of situations before we know what the natural regen's going to do, and certainly sometimes not planting the right species where, like you're saying, I mean, 15, 20 years down the road after this fire, then is when you can